Chapter 1. Introduction. Why Caesar is still fascinating today. Hardly any other figure in world history has attracted as much attention over thousands of years as Gaius Julius Caesar. His name has become synonymous with power, politics, and intrigue. Even today, the word Caesar sounds like a title, and in fact, the German Kaiser, as well as the Russian Tsar, are derived from it. Whoever pronounces his name thinks of Rome, of wars and victories, of reforms and assassinations. But Caesar was more than a general, more than a dictator, and more than just a victim of political conspiracy. He was a personality who, with a sharp mind, irrepressible energy, and political skill, steered the history of Europe in a new direction. The fascination with Caesar lies in its complexity. He was a politician and soldier, writer and orator, reformer and power seeker. It combined the virtues and contradictions of the Roman world: ambition, bravery, a sense of honor, but also ruthlessness, cunning, and an almost boundless greed for fame. For some, he was a brilliant statesman who renewed Rome and laid the foundations for the empire. For others, he was a tyrant who destroyed the freedom of the republic and betrayed the Roman polity with his striving for autocracy. The history of Caesar is at the same time the history of the last decades of the Roman Republic. It is the story of a society torn apart by internal tensions, between rich and poor, between the Senate and the people, between traditional aristocrats and aspiring leaders. In this world, Caesar moved with a certainty and a feeling that set him apart from others. He understood that power was not secured by birth or possessions alone, but by wise alliances, the benevolence of the people, and success in war. What distinguished him from many of his contemporaries was his ability to reinvent himself again and again. As a young aristocrat who initially had to assert himself in the turmoil of the civil wars, he emerged early on with skill and courage. As a general in Gaul, he demonstrated not only military brilliance, but also the ability to immortalize his successes through his own writings. As a politician in Rome, he used all means, bribery, propaganda, diplomacy, to reach the top. And as a dictator, he sought reforms that would improve the lives of citizens, even if they secured his power at the same time. The fact that Caesar still fascinates today is not least due to his dramatic end. The conspiracy of the senators who murdered him on the Ides of March 44 BC is one of the most famous scenes in history. It has inspired poets, artists, and historians alike, from Shakespeare to modern films. The moment when Brutus, his alleged friend, raised his sword against him symbolizes the betrayal that has become the stuff of legends for centuries. But Caesar's significance goes far beyond his life. He shaped the language. His commentarium on the Gallic War are still considered masterpieces of clear prose today. He changed the calculation of time. His Julian calendar is the basis of today's calendar. He left behind a political structure that, albeit in a modified form, became the foundation of the Roman Empire. Caesar was a man full of contradictions, and perhaps that is precisely what makes him so fascinating. He was ambitious, but also generous, brutal in war, but charming in personal dealings, visionary in his reforms, but blind to the fears he triggered in the Senate. He wanted to be loved and feared at the same time. He was someone who was bigger than life and who knew how to stage himself in order to become immortal. The confrontation with Caesar is therefore not only a journey into the past, but also a mirror for the present. Questions about power and morality, about freedom and security, about reform and revolution accompany us to this day. In Caesar, we recognize the politician who mastered the game of power, and at the same time, the man whose ambition led him to ruin. So it is no wonder that, even after more than 2,000 years, Julius Caesar lives not only in history books, but also in our language, in our institutions, and in our thinking. His story is that of an era that laid the foundation of our civilization, and of a man who has become a symbol of the greatness and abysses of human endeavor. Chapter 2. The world of the Roman Republic. To understand Julius Caesar, you have to look at the world in which he lived. Rome was a republic in the 1st century BC, a form of government that was proud to have turned away from the rule of kings. Since the expulsion of the last Etruscan king in 509 BC, no individual ruled over Rome, but the people and their institutions. But people did not mean all people equally, but above all the citizens. And among them, the leading families, the long-established aristocracy, played the decisive role. The Roman Republic was a complicated web of power and tradition. At the top was the Senate, a body of several hundred men, mostly former officials from the powerful families. The Senate was officially only an advisory body, but its authority was enormous. He determined foreign policy, directed finances, and influenced laws. In addition, there were the popular assemblies, in which the Roman citizens voted on laws and elected officials. These officials, the so-called magistrates, were elected annually and shared power. The most important were the 2 consuls, who each had the highest power for 1 year. This career in office, the cursus honorum, was the path to power for ambitious politicians, and it was marked by ambition, rivalry, and intrigue. Roman society was strictly hierarchical. At the top were the patrician families, who had expanded their influence over generations. On the other side were the plebeians, the simple citizens who had rights but often suffered from the domination of the aristocracy. There had been conflicts between these 2 groups over the centuries, but by the 1st century BC, the differences had weakened but not completely resolved. More important than the old distinction was now the division between the rich and the poor. Rome had become immensely rich through its wars and conquests. Provinces in Spain, Greece, Asia, and Africa provided tributes, grain, and slaves. Many senators and knights, that was the wealthy knighthood, profited from this, bought huge estates, and had slaves work on them. The ordinary citizens, on the other hand, often lived in poverty, in the cramped tenements of the city, dependent on grain donations and political favor. The result was increasing social tension. Popular leaders, the so-called populars, sided with the poor and demanded reforms: land distribution, debt relief, political participation. Their opponents, the optimates, wanted to preserve the power of the Senate and the aristocracy. This contrast shaped politics and repeatedly led to conflicts, which were often carried out violently. Rome was also in a state of upheaval militarily during this time. The army consisted of citizens who were originally obliged to serve in the war. But the long campaigns and the growing number of poor citizens led to generals beginning to provide and pay their soldiers themselves. This gave rise to a new loyalty, no longer to Rome, but to the generals who cared for their men. This development gave rise to dangerous private power bases that increasingly destabilized the Republic. The 1st century BC was therefore a time of transition, full of crises and opportunities. Rome had become a world power, but its political structures were still tailored to a small city-state republic. The tensions between tradition and change, between the Senate and the people, between rich and poor, between old families and aspiring men, made this era a stage on which great personalities could emerge. Men like Sulla, Pompey, Crassus, and finally Caesar. Julius Caesar grew up in this world full of contradictions, ambition, and restlessness. The Republic was proud of its freedom, but in reality it was a playground for power struggles, intrigues, and civil wars. And it was precisely in this game that Caesar was to become the master, one who understood the rules and at the same time broke them so skillfully that he changed history forever. Chapter 3: Caesar's Origin in Youth. Julius Caesar was born in Rome on July 12 or 13th of the year 100 BC. His family, the gens Julia, belonged to the long-established patrician families that traced their descent back to the legendary goddess Venus. This divine origin was not just a myth, but a valuable political capital that Caesar later cleverly used for his self-promotion. But despite this venerable family tree, the family was not among the most influential in Rome during Caesar's lifetime. She belonged to the respected but not the most powerful nobility. His father, Gaius Julius Caesar, held the office of praetor and administered the province of Asia for a time. His mother, Aurelia, came from a wealthy and influential plebeian family known for their virtue and severity. Aurelia had a decisive influence on her son's upbringing and was praised for her intelligence and strength. Contemporaries credited her with playing a decisive role in her son becoming a man of such energy and assertiveness. Caesar's youth fell into an eventful time. The Roman Republic was marked by political unrest and social conflicts. In particular, the conflicts between the optimates, the representatives of the Senate nobility, and the populars, the leaders of the people, determined the climate. Caesar's family was traditionally close to the populars, which pushed him early on in a political direction that would later bring him into conflict with the conservative forces again and again. An important event in his youth was the dictatorship of Sulla. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a supporter of the Optimates, had seized power after a bloody civil war and had numerous supporters of the populars persecuted and murdered. Caesar, who was married to Cornelia, the daughter of a populist politician, was himself in danger. Sulla demanded that he divorce his wife, but Caesar refused, a remarkable act of resistance for a young man without much power. Sulla then deprived him of the priesthood he already held and persecuted him. Caesar had to go into hiding, lived in exile, and narrowly escaped death. He changed his hiding place several times and often escaped the dictator's captors only through luck and the help of his family and friends. This experience shaped him. He learned early on that political power had to be defended not only with offices but also with courage, loyalty, and tactical skill. Eventually, after years of power struggle, Sulla resigned, and Caesar was able to return to Rome. Even at a young age, Caesar showed a remarkable talent for rhetoric. He studied with the best teachers and was known for his clear, haunting, and at the same time elegant language. His speeches convinced with logic and passion. His voice captivated the audience. Later, as a general, he masterfully used this ability to inspire his soldiers and disarm his political opponents. He also gained experience in military service at an early age. He served in Asia Minor and distinguished himself in battles, which earned him his first awards for bravery at a young age. The episode when Caesar was captured by pirates on his way to Rhodes is famous. The pirates demanded a ransom, but Caesar, aware of his dignity, mocked them and demanded that they demand an even higher sum because he was worth more. During his imprisonment, he remained calm, recited poems, and promised the pirates that he would have them crucified after his release. And indeed, after he was released, he raised a small fleet, pursued the pirates, seized them, and had them executed. This event already shows the character of Caesar: courage, self-confidence, humor, and a relentless consistency towards his enemies. Thus, Caesar's youth did not take place in sheltered security, but in constant confrontation with power and danger. He learned to assert himself, to refuse to compromise when it came to his convictions, and to always put his own value above all else. These qualities made him a man who could not only survive, but prevail at a time when Rome was defined by intrigue, violence, and ambition. Chapter 4. First military experience and career in office. After the dramatic years of his youth, Caesar began to find his place in the political and military life of Rome. It became clear early on that he was not only a man of words, but also of action. He gained his first significant experience in the military in Asia Minor, where he served under the governor Marcus Minucius Thermus. During this time, he proved himself in the siege of the city of Mytilene and was awarded the Corona Civica, the citizen's crown, for his courage, one of the highest Roman honors for bravery in battle. He also served in Bithynia, and although many rumors circulated about his mission there, especially about his alleged closeness to King Nicomedes, it was clear that Caesar knew how to use diplomatic skills and personal charisma. Even here, his ability to assert himself in a wide variety of situations was indicated, be it through courage, cleverness, or charm. After his return to Rome, Caesar began the cursus honorum, the official career that was the path to fame and influence for ambitious politicians. Initially, he held the office of military tribune, a position that connected him more closely with the people and the legions. This was followed by the office of quaestor, which brought him to the Senate and gave him his first direct influence on the administration of the Roman state. During this time, Caesar made important connections. He acted as a lawyer and defended trials with sharp wit and great rhetorical skill. His speeches made him famous and earned him his first followers. In particular, his attacks on corrupt governors and his closeness to the populace showed that he was on the side of the reform forces, which represented the people against the old aristocracy. His path soon led him abroad. He worked as a quaestor in Spain, where he not only gained administrative experience but also deepened his military skills. The vastness of the country, the power of the Roman armies, and the challenges of the province gave him a first taste of what he would later experience on a large scale. On his return to Rome, Caesar married Pompeia, a granddaughter of the dictator Sulla and granddaughter of the famous general Gaius Marius. This marriage connected him to influential families and strengthened his political position. But after the infamous Bona Dea celebration scandal, in which a man in women's clothes broke into Pompeia's house, Caesar divorced her. His reasoning became legendary. Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. In doing so, he underlined his claim to moral inviolability, even if he himself was by no means free of affairs. A further step in his career was the office of aedile. As such, he was responsible for public games, buildings, and the supply of the city. Caesar used this office masterfully to make himself popular with the people. He organized magnificent games, had arenas and streets decorated, and distributed gifts. He got into huge debt, but he knew that popularity and fame were worth more than short-term financial stability. Soon the office of praetor followed, which gave him greater political powers. Here, too, he showed his closeness to the populace and repeatedly called for reforms. But his ambition went further. His destination was the consulate, the highest office in the Republic. To do this, he needed not only popularity, but also military fame and strong allies. In Spain, where he was sent as provost, he found an opportunity to win both. There, he led campaigns against rebellious tribes, defeated them, and acquired the title of Imperator, an honorary title awarded by soldiers to their general. At the same time, he restructured the finances of the province, canceled debts, and reorganized the administration. His reputation as a capable general and just administrator spread. But Spain was only a stage for him. When he saw a statue of Alexander the Great there, he is said to have burst into tears, because Alexander had already conquered half the world at his age, while he himself was still at the beginning. This feeling of unfulfilled ambition drove him back to Rome, determined to take the lead there. This is how Caesar's first steps on the stage of world history ended, as an ambitious young man who held political office with brilliance, won the people with games, won his first victories in the military, and carried in his heart the burning desire to achieve more than anyone before him. Chapter 5. Caesar's Rise in Roman Politics. When Caesar returned from Spain, he was determined to take his political career to the highest level. His goal was clear: the consulate, the most important office of the Roman Republic. But to achieve it, he needed more than popularity and military merit. He needed money, allies, and, above all, the ability to master the intrigues of Roman politics. Rome was a seething cauldron at that time. The tensions between the Optimates, who defended the influence of the Senate and the aristocracy, and the populares, who had the people on their side, determined the political climate. Caesar clearly sided with the populares. He understood that he could not secure his power through conservative circles, but only through the support of the people and through alliances with influential men who, like him, aspired to power. To prepare his candidacy for the consulate, he formed a remarkable alliance, the First Triumvirate. Together with Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, the most successful general of his time, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, he joined forces. Everyone brought something with them. Pompey had military fame, Crassus had immeasurable funds, and Caesar had the charm of the people and the ability to bring together the two opposing personalities. Without him, this alliance would never have come about. In 59 BC, Caesar was elected consul. From the very beginning, he used the office to achieve his political goals. He introduced laws that distributed land to poor citizens and to Pompey's veterans. In doing so, he won the support of the people and, at the same time, the gratitude of his powerful ally. His opponents in the Senate tried to block him, but Caesar prevailed with cunning and energy. If necessary, he did not shy away from violence. His supporters put pressure on voters and kept opponents at bay. His consulate made him a hero of the people, but also an enemy of the aristocrats. After the end of his office, he therefore sought a new power base. He was given command of the provinces of Gallia Cisalpina and Gallia Narbonensis, with the addition of an army that swore allegiance to him. This gave him not only a prestigious post, but also military power that made him independent of the whims of the Senate. At the same time, he knew how to further increase his popularity. He married Calpurnia, the daughter of an influential senator, and established further networks. He gave Pompey to his daughter Julia as his wife, a clever move that also secured the political alliance in the family. It was during this phase that Caesar's special talent became apparent. He was not just a player in the political power struggle, but a strategist who planned for the long term. While many of his rivals were intent on short-term advantages, Caesar saw further. He knew that Rome had rich provinces on its borders that could still be conquered, and that military glory was the surest basis for political power. So he prepared his greatest step, the campaign into Gaul. Officially, the aim was to protect Roman interests and put down uprisings. In reality, however, it was an opportunity to build an army, achieve unlimited fame, and create a power base greater than anything Rome had seen before. Caesar had made his way into the top league of Roman politics. From a persecuted young man who once had to flee from Sulla, he had risen to consul of the Republic and the most dangerous player in Rome's power structure. Now the next phase began, a phase that was to make him not only the most powerful man of his time, but also the bearer of Rome's destiny. Chapter 6. Consulate and the First Triumvirate. The year 59 BC marked a decisive turning point in Caesar's life. With his election as consul, the highest regular office in the Republic, he had achieved his first major goal. But he knew that a consulate alone was not enough to secure lasting influence. The term of office was only 1 year, and after that there was a threat of falling into insignificance if the foundations for the future were not laid in time. Caesar, however, was too ambitious to be content with a brief fame. Even before his election, he had laid the foundation for his power. The alliance with Pompey and Crassus, which later became known as the First Triumvirate. This three-man alliance was not an official state organ, but a private agreement based on mutual benefit. Pompey, the radiant general, longed for his soldiers to receive land and for his decisions to be recognized in the East. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, wanted political influence that had previously been denied him. Finally, Caesar needed money, support, and backing in the Senate to push through his political projects. The alliance was explosive because Pompey and Crassus were bitter rivals. But Caesar knew how to connect them. With his diplomatic skills and personal charm, he brought together two men who distrusted each other and made himself the linchpin of their interests. In order to establish the connection even closer, he married his daughter Julia to Pompey, a bond that also secured the alliance in the family. As consul, Caesar used his position with all determination. He introduced laws granting land to the veterans of Pompey, thus ensuring the fulfillment of a long-standing demand. He pushed through a law that limited the power of tax tenants in the provinces, which accommodated Crassus and his business partners. At the same time, he ensured a reorganization of the provinces, which promised him a lucrative and influential position even after the expiration of his consulate. The conservative senators, the optimates, tried to block his plans. But Caesar did not shy away from confrontation. If he did not succeed in the Senate, he pushed through the laws in the People's Assembly, supported by the masses who cheered him. His opponents accused him of trampling on the traditions of the Republic, but Caesar knew that if you had the people on your side, you could break even the resistance of the most powerful aristocrats. His consulate was characterized by a mixture of ruthlessness and brilliance. He was not intimidated by threats, organized pompous games, and won over the people. And at the same time, he always kept in mind the greater goal, building a power base that would last beyond the year. At the end of his term of office, he secured command of the provinces of Gallia Cisalpina and Gallia Narbonensis as well as Illyria through clever agreements, combined with the supreme command of several legions for 5 years. This laid the foundation for what was to take his career to a new dimension, the conquest of Gaul. The First Triumvirate functioned in these years as an instrument of power that superimposed the structures of the Republic. 3 men divided Rome among themselves, supported each other, and kept their opponents at bay. But it soon became clear that such an alliance, based on ambition and self-interest, could not last. For the moment, however, Caesar had reached his goal. He had reached the pinnacle of the Republican career, with the people behind him and a province with armies in his hands. What began as a political alliance was in fact the prelude to a power struggle that was to shake the Republic to its foundations. Chapter 7: Caesar's Conquest of Gaul. With the end of his consulship and the beginning of his provincial command in 58 BC, Julius Caesar opened a new chapter, the chapter that would turn him from an ambitious politician to the most famous general in Rome. Gaul, the area north of Italy, was only partially under Roman control at that time. Although Rome ruled the southern province of Gallia Narbonensis, the vast territories beyond it were inhabited by Celtic tribes that had their own culture, language, and political structures. They were often at odds with each other, but if they joined forces, they could pose a serious threat to Rome. Caesar saw a huge opportunity in Gaul. Officially, it was supposed to protect the borders and ensure peace. But he understood that a successful campaign would bring him fame, fortune, and a loyal army, the 3 pillars needed to be untouchable in Rome. While his rivals in Rome were entangled in intrigues, Caesar wanted to make history in the north. His first major deployment came when the Helvetians, a Celtic tribe from the area of present-day Switzerland, tried to emigrate westwards on a large scale. Hundreds of thousands of people moved with wagons and cattle, and their train threatened the stability of the Roman provinces. Caesar opposed them and, after several battles, forced them to return to their homeland. In doing so, he won not only the gratitude of the Roman citizens in southern Gaul, but also the reputation of an energetic and resolute general. Shortly afterwards, he turned against Germanic tribes under Arovistus, who had invaded Gaul. In a swift and determined campaign, he defeated Arovistus and drove the Germanic tribes back across the Rhine. These victories not only gave him security at the border, but also admiration in Rome. In the following years, Caesar continued to expand his campaigns. He subjugated the Celtic tribes one after the other, defeated opponents in bloody battles, and skillfully used alliances with individual tribes to isolate others. His tactics were as flexible as they were ruthless. Where he could use diplomacy, he did it. Where force was necessary, he struck without hesitation. Entire cities were destroyed, tens of thousands of people killed or enslaved. It was a triumph for the Romans, a trauma for the Gauls. Caesar's campaign against the Belgians in the north and his 2 expeditions to Britain became particularly famous. Although he was not able to conquer the island permanently, the mere fact that he crossed the sea with his legions made a tremendous impression. He portrayed Rome as the power that could reach even the most distant lands. A highlight of his campaigns was the crossing of the Rhine. In order to impress the Germanic tribes, he had a huge bridge built over the river in a few days, led his legions across, marched on enemy territory for a few days, and then returned again after he had set the signal. No river, no country was out of reach for Rome. But with all his victories, Caesar eventually met with serious resistance. The Gauls began to realize that they were stronger together. Under the leadership of the young king Vercingetorix, many tribes united in a great uprising. In 52 BC, the decisive Battle of Alesia took place, where Caesar encountered a huge superiority of around 60,000 men. The siege of Alesia became a masterpiece of military art. Caesar had double fortifications built, one to block the encircled city and one to defend himself against the advancing Gallic relief armies. After fierce fighting, he won, a triumph that finally secured his position. Vercingetorix surrendered and was taken to Rome, where he was led through the streets years later in Caesar's triumphal procession and then executed. With the defeat of the Gauls, the resistance was broken. Caesar had conquered a huge area that was henceforth under Roman influence. Gaul became one of the richest provinces of the empire, and the booty that Caesar brought to Rome filled his coffers and provided him with invaluable means of power. But Gaul did not only bring Caesar wealth and fame. Through the years of campaigns, he won the unconditional loyalty of his legions. The soldiers who had served under him revered him. They had shared hunger, cold, and blood with him. They had won victories that amazed all Europe. For them, Caesar was not only a general, but a leader who was followed to the ends of the earth. Thus, after almost 10 years in Gaul, Caesar returned not as a provincial administrator, but as the most powerful man in Rome. A general who was richer, more popular, and more dangerous than anyone else. But it was precisely this success that made the conflict with his rivals inevitable. Chapter 8. The Encounter with Vercingetorix. Among all the battles that Caesar waged in Gaul, one episode stands out in particular: the confrontation with Vercingetorix, the Gallic leader who became a symbol of the resistance. This young prince of the Arverni understood what many Gallic tribes had not realized until then. Only in unity could the Gauls have a chance against Rome. Vercingetorix was charismatic, determined, and courageous. It united a multitude of tribes that had previously been fragmented and often hostile. Under his leadership, Gaul rose in 52 BC for a last great revolt against the Roman superiority. For the first time, Caesar and his legions faced an opponent who was not only warlike, but also politically skilled. Vercingetorix chose a tactic that caused great difficulties for Caesar. Instead of engaging in open battles, he practiced scorched earth. Villages were burned down, supplies destroyed, fields rendered unusable, all to cut off the Romans from supplies. For the legions, who were dependent on food and support from the country, this was an enormous challenge. A first major confrontation came at Gergovia, where Caesar suffered a severe defeat. The Gallic warriors defended their homeland with desperate courage, and Caesar's troops were forced to retreat. This defeat was a shock for Rome and strengthened the resistance in Gaul. For the first time, it seemed as if the mighty Caesar could be stopped. But Caesar did not give up. He gathered his troops, reorganized his supply lines, and sought the decision. It came at the fortress of Alesia, the seat of Vercingetorix. There, the Gaul entrenched himself with his troops, while huge relief armies from all over Gaul rushed to free him. The siege of Alesia became one of the greatest masterpieces of military engineering. Caesar had a double ring of fortifications built, an inner one to block the trapped Gauls and an outer one to defend himself against the advancing auxiliary troops. Miles of ramparts, ditches, towers, and palisades transformed the site into a fortress. The battles that followed were fierce. From the inside, the trapped desperately tried to break through the lines of the Romans. The relief armies stormed again and again from the outside, hoping to free their brothers. The Romans stood between the hammer and the anvil, and stood firm. In the decisive moments, Caesar himself was at the front. He rode along the lines with a red cloak, the sign of his leadership, cheered on his men, and fought with the sword in his hand. His presence gave the legionnaires courage, while the Gauls were repeatedly beaten back despite their numerical superiority. Finally, the resistance was broken. The relief armies fled, and those trapped in Alasia had to give up. Vercingetorix realized that the battle was lost. In a scene that became legendary, he rode to Caesar in full armor, dismounted from his horse, and laid down his weapons. This ended the Great Gallic Uprising. Vercingetorix was captured and taken to Rome. Years later, he was led through the streets in Caesar's triumphal procession before being executed in prison. For the Gauls, he became a national hero, for Caesar, the symbol of his final victory. The encounter between Caesar and Vercingetorix was more than just a military duel. It was the meeting of two charismatic leaders, two visions, Roman expansion and Gallic freedom. For Rome, the victory meant the final triumph over Gaul. For the Gauls, the loss of their independence. But for Caesar, Alasia was more than a victory. It was the highlight of his career, a triumph that made him immortal. His reports on the Gallic War, in which he described these events, became a masterpiece of political propaganda and cemented his reputation as a general and statesman. With Alasia, he had proven that he was not only victorious, but invincible. Chapter 9. The Consequences of the Gallic Conquests. With the victory at Alasia and the capture of Vercingetorix, the resistance of the Gauls was broken. After almost 10 years of uninterrupted campaigns, Gaul was now under Roman control. For Caesar, this was not only a military success, but a triumph that fundamentally changed his position in Rome. The conquered territories brought enormous riches. Cities were plundered, treasures were brought to Rome, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners were sold as slaves. The slave trade flourished, and the proceeds flowed directly into Caesar's coffers. With this wealth, he was not only able to pay off his immense debts, but also forge new political alliances, finance games, and buy followers. His victory in Gaul made him one of the richest men in Rome. But even more valuable to him than money was the loyalty of his armies. For 10 years, his legions had fought at his side. They had gone through hunger, cold, and countless battles, had won victories and overcome defeats. Caesar shared their hardships, talked to his soldiers, knew their names. This personal bond made him a general whom his men loved and whom they followed until death. This loyalty was to become decisive later when he marched against his own countrymen. The conquest of Gaul also had enormous political consequences. In Rome, his opponents watched with growing concern as Caesar became more and more powerful. A general of enormous wealth, with veterans devoted to him, and with the glory of having subdued all Gaul, that was a danger to the Republic. Pompey in particular, once his ally in the Triumvirate, began to become estranged from him. The marriage between Pompey and Caesar's daughter Julia had long stabilized the alliance. But after her death in 54 BC, this bond was broken. The Senate, in which the conservative Optimates dominated, increasingly sought proximity to Pompey in order to keep Caesar in check. It became clear that a collision was inevitable. While Caesar strengthened his power base in Gaul, Pompey positioned himself as a defender of order in Rome. But the Gallic Wars also had an ideological dimension. Caesar was a master at depicting his campaigns in his Commentari de Bello Gallico, sober, clear accounts that gave the impression that he had merely defended Rome and brought peace. In reality, they were wars of conquest, but to the readers in Rome, they appeared to be necessary and glorious undertakings. These writings served as propaganda and made Caesar not only a hero on the battlefield, but also a celebrated writer. The consequences for Gaul itself were profound. The Celtic tribes lost their independence. Their structures were destroyed, and Roman administration and culture spread. Roads, cities, and colonies were built, trade and agriculture were organized according to the Roman model. Gaul became one of the most important provinces of the empire, rich, fertile, and of central strategic importance. But for Rome, Caesar's success also meant a burden. Many aristocrats feared that he would return to Italy with his army and seize power. The fame he had achieved in Gaul was so great that even his opponents could not attack him openly without making themselves unpopular. But behind the scenes, the tension grew. Caesar's Gallic conquests were thus a double sword. They made him invincible and untouchable, but they also widened the gap between him and the Senate. The successful general had become a man who was too powerful to fit into the structures of the old republic. The next step, that much was clear, could only be a direct conflict, a civil war. Chapter 10. The Break with Pompey. After almost a decade in Gaul, Caesar's gaze returned to Rome. His successes had made him the most powerful man of his time, but it was precisely this fame that broke old alliances and created new enmities. The First Triumvirate that had once carried him to the top had now disintegrated. Crassus had fallen in the battle against the Parthians at Carrhae in 53 BC, and Pompey, Caesar's former ally and son-in-law, had become estranged from him. The reasons for the break between Caesar and Pompey lay not only in personal ambition, but also in the political realities of Rome. After the death of Julia, Caesar's daughter and his wife, Pompey was no longer family-bound to Caesar. The Senate, which viewed Caesar's growing power with suspicion, courted Pompey and portrayed him as the defender of the Republic. Pompey soon found himself at the head of the conservative forces, while Caesar remained the leader of the populars. In Rome, the situation came to a head. The Optimates demanded that Caesar, after the expiration of his command in Gaul, dismiss his legions and return to Rome to answer for himself as a private citizen. They hoped to bring him to justice and prosecute him for his alleged violations of the law. Caesar, however, knew that political annihilation awaited him without his army. The numerous enemies he had made in the Senate would not miss an opportunity to overthrow him. He therefore demanded to be allowed to extend his command until he could run for the consulate again. This would give him the opportunity to preserve his political immunity. But the Senate, under Pompey's influence, refused. Instead, Pompey himself was given command of the defense of Italy and was effectively appointed the sole protector of the Republic. The fronts were now clearly drawn. Caesar stood with his legions in Gaul, rich, popular, and victorious. Pompey had Rome, the Senate, and the state power behind him. A collision was inevitable. In the winter of 50-49 BC, the decision was made. The Senate ordered Caesar to disband his armies and return to Rome. Caesar, however, saw this as a death sentence for his career and perhaps for his life. Instead, he made a decision that would change history. He led his troops across the small Rubicon River, which formed the border between his province and Italy. With the words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast, he crossed the border on January 10, 49 BC. This step was an open break with the Senate, a queer beginning of the Civil War. For no general was allowed to lead his army into Italy without permission. Caesar, however, did just that, and thus opposed the centuries-old order of the Republic. Panic broke out in Rome. Pompey and many senators hastily fled to Greece instead of facing Caesar in Italy. Within a short time, Caesar took the country without much resistance. The cities opened their gates to him. Many officers changed sides. It turned out that his popularity was great not only on the battlefield, but also among the ordinary citizens of Rome. The break with Pompey was final, and the die had indeed been cast. The political rival had become the archenemy, the old alliance a deadly enmity. The civil war that now began was to decide not only the fate of two men, but the fate of the entire Roman Republic.
Chapter 11. The Rubicon and the Beginning of the Civil War. The moment Caesar crossed the Rubicon was far more than a military movement. It was a symbol, an irreversible step that plunged Rome's future into a maelstrom of civil war and upheaval. The Rubicon was a small river, hardly worth mentioning, but its political importance was enormous. No general was allowed to cross it with his legions without being guilty of high treason. When Caesar crossed over with the 13th Legion, he knew there was no turning back. The die has fallen. Whether Caesar really spoke this sentence or whether it was a later embellishment hardly matters. In any case, he expressed the awareness that he was now putting all his eggs in one basket. It was not just about his own career, but about life and death, victory or annihilation. The reactions in Rome were panicky. The Senate was completely surprised by the speed with which Caesar acted. Pompeius, the great general, was not prepared to raise an army in Italy at once. Instead of confronting Caesar, he backed away, fled with many senators to Brundisium in the south, and from there crossed over to Greece. The capital was suddenly defenseless, and Caesar marched in almost without resistance. In Italy, the effect of his years of policy was evident. Many cities willingly opened their gates to him, officials and soldiers switched sides, and even ordinary citizens greeted him. Caesar did not present himself as a conqueror, but as a liberator. He promised clemency, refrained from looting, and declared that he only wanted to defend his rights and the dignity of the people. This staging made him a hero, while Pompey and the Optimates appeared as cowards who had abandoned the city. But Caesar knew that the real battle was yet to come. His opponents had fled to Greece, where Pompey had powerful resources at his disposal. He had access to the rich provinces of the East, a huge fleet, and many allies. To survive against him, Caesar had to act quickly. First, he secured Italy, and then moved to Spain, where Pompey's governor stood with strong troops. He defeated them with lightning-fast maneuvers before Pompey himself could intervene. "I am going to fight an army without a general. Then I will return to fight a general without an army," Caesar is said to have said, a sentence that shows his strategic clarity. After the victory in Spain, he turned back to the east. Pompey gathered a formidable force there, supported by many senators and nobles who believed they could save the Republic by overthrowing Caesar. But Caesar knew that despite his numerical inferiority, he could rely on his loyalty and speed. The civil war had begun, and it could no longer be stopped. Rome was divided. On the one hand, Caesar, who presented himself as the advocate of the people and the guarantor of order and grace. On the other, Pompey and the Senate, who fought for the tradition of the Republic but had lost prestige through their flight and their hesitation. The Rubicon had been crossed, not only geographically but also figuratively. The Republic was at a point of no return. The decisive battle for power in Rome had begun. Chapter 12. Victories over Pompey and the Battle of Pharsalos. After Caesar had secured Italy and Spain, he turned his gaze to the east, where Pompey and the Optimates were gathering a formidable army. Pompey was still a gifted general, and he had resources that seemed far superior to Caesar. The east of the empire was rich, the naval force was on its side, and numerous senators and nobles supported it. Everything indicated that Caesar, who competed with comparatively few legions, was in a hopeless situation. But Caesar had something that Pompey lacked, an army that loved him to death. His soldiers were battle-hardened, had served at his side in Gaul for 10 years, and knew his way of leading. They were less numerous, but unwaveringly loyal. And Caesar himself was not a man who was impressed by numbers. He relied on speed, surprise, and his unshakable belief in his own fate. In 48 BC, there was a decisive conflict. Pompey had entrenched himself in Greece and hoped to wear Caesar down through blockades and hunger. But Caesar managed to cross the sea despite difficult circumstances and land on the Greek mainland with his legions. For weeks, there were smaller battles and maneuvers in which both sides tried to gain advantages. The decision was finally made by the city of Pharsalos in Thessaly. Pompey had about 40,000 men supported by a strong cavalry, while Caesar had barely 20,000 legionaries. The majority of observers considered Caesar's situation to be hopeless, but he trusted his experience and the discipline of his troops. Pompey relied on his cavalry, which was to break through Caesar's right flank. But Caesar had foreseen the plan. He set up a hidden line of experienced legionnaires behind his cavalry who were to intervene at the decisive moment. When Pompey's horsemen attacked, they did not meet a weak flank, but determined veterans who threw them back. From that moment on, the battle tipped. Caesar's legions pressed forward, united, disciplined, and unstoppable. Pompey's superior numbers were of no use because his soldiers fought less resolutely. Finally, his army broke apart. The defeat was complete, and Pompey himself fled the battlefield, defeated by an opponent he had once considered his younger partner. Caesar's victory at Pharsalos was not only a military masterpiece, but also a political turning point. The optimates who had bet on Pompey were defeated, their power base destroyed. Pompey fled to Egypt in the hope of finding refuge there. But the king of Egypt, Ptolemy XIII, had him murdered for fear of Caesar's wrath. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria shortly afterwards and received the severed head of his former ally and later rival, he is said to have cried. Not only because a great man ended in such an ignominious way, but also because the tragedy of their broken alliance was before his eyes. With the Battle of Pharsalos, Caesar had risen to become the undisputed lord of Rome. He had defeated the most powerful general of his time, and his path to autocracy was now almost unstoppable. But instead of being satisfied with this triumph, he moved on to Egypt, where another story began that would connect him to a woman whose name is as immortal as his, Cleopatra. Chapter 13. Caesar in Egypt, Cleopatra and the Nile Policy. After the victory at Pharsalus and the flight of Pompey, Caesar pursued his rival as far as Egypt. But instead of a political opponent, he found only a corpse there. The young king Ptolemy XIII had Pompey murdered on his own initiative, hoping to secure Caesar's favor. When Caesar's soldiers presented him with Pompey's severed head and signet ring, Caesar reacted not with gratitude, but with horror. The sight of the former comrade in arms, now the victim of a cowardly intrigue, filled him with anger and sadness. Pompey had been his enemy, but also a great Roman, and Caesar wanted to decide his fate himself, not a foreign king. So Caesar entered a new stage, the world of Ptolemaic Egypt. This empire was rich and powerful, but internally torn. The dispute over the throne between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra VII divided the country. Cleopatra had been exiled from Alexandria, but she was determined to regain her power. Caesar, who acted as an arbitrator, was soon drawn into the conflict, and found in Cleopatra not only a political partner, but also a lover. Legend has it that Cleopatra was brought to Caesar hidden in a carpet or a bedsheet to meet him secretly. Whether this story is true in all its details is uncertain, but it is certain that Cleopatra used all her cleverness, beauty, and charisma to win Caesar over. And she succeeded. The Roman general, who was already over 50 years old at the time, fell for the queen, who was almost 30 years younger. A political encounter turned into a passionate relationship. Caesar supported Cleopatra in her claim to the throne. The resulting Alexandrian War put him in great danger. For weeks he fought with his legions in the streets of the city, besieged and harassed by the troops of the young Ptolemy and his allies. Several times he was in a bad way, and it was only through determination and tactical genius that he escaped defeat. Eventually, reinforcements arrived from Rome and Syria, and Caesar won the victory. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while fleeing,
and Cleopatra ascended the throne with Caesar's support. This began a relationship that went far beyond politics. Cleopatra understood that through Caesar she could secure her power in Egypt, and Caesar enjoyed the company of a woman who was not only beautiful but also educated, proud, and self-confident. She embodied the splendor of the ancient Pharaoh Empire that fascinated Caesar. Together they sailed on the Nile, a journey that became a legend and was considered a symbol of their union in ancient times. From this relationship came a son, Ptolemy XV, called Caesarion. This was a sensitive issue for the Romans. Many saw Cleopatra as a dangerous seductress who alienated Caesar from Rome and drew him into the decadence of the East. But Caesar was not deterred. He later even brought Cleopatra to Rome, where she lived in a magnificent palace on the Tiber. The political significance of his Egyptian episode was enormous. Caesar thus ensured Roman supremacy over Egypt, which was vital for Rome as the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. At the same time, he showed that he was not only a general, but also a world politician who thought beyond the borders of Rome. But his opponents in Rome saw his behavior as a sign of megalomania. A general who lived with a queen, who surrounded himself with oriental splendor and even had a child with her, all this seemed like a break with republican traditions. Caesar, however, saw no problem in this. For him, it was self-evident that he was greater than the narrow limits that the Senate wanted to set for him. The encounter with Cleopatra was therefore not only a love story, but a mirror of his character. He sought greatness, fame, the extraordinary, and in Cleopatra he found a partner who embodied all of this. Together, they stood for a new, almost royal concept of power that went far beyond the old republic.
Chapter 14. Further Campaigns, Africa and Spain. Although Caesar had triumphed in Egypt and placed Cleopatra on the throne, his rule over Rome was far from secure. The civil war was by no means over. Many optimates had survived the defeated Pharsalos and gathered in Africa, where they raised new troops with the help of the provinces there and the Numidian king Juba. These remnants of the Pompeian party were determined to continue the struggle. Caesar returned to Rome to consolidate his power, but he knew that his victory would only last if he eliminated the last enemies militarily. So he moved to Africa in 46 BC to face the new threat. The opponents were strong. They had numerous legions at their disposal and believed that Caesar would finally reach his limits. The decision was made at the Battle of Thapsus. Despite the numerical superiority of the opponents, Caesar relied on the discipline and experience of his veterans. With clever tactics, he made the enemies falter and achieved a complete victory. The Pompeian leaders Cato the Younger and Metellus Scipio committed suicide to avoid falling into Caesar's hands. With this triumph, the power of the optimates in Africa was finally broken. But the civil war was not over yet. In Spain, Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus Pompeius, gathered again with the remains of their father's followers. Spain was a difficult terrain, full of uprisings and far from Rome. But Caesar knew that he had to win there as well, in order to leave no room for his opponents to retreat. In 45 BC, the Battle of Munda took place, one of the toughest conflicts in Caesar's career. The opponents fought desperately, and even Caesar's legions faltered at times. It was one of the rare occasions when his victory was on the line. But finally, he managed to break the enemy lines. Gnaeus Pompey fell in battle. Sextus escaped, but was also defeated years later. With the victory at Munda, the civil war was practically over. Caesar had eliminated all rivals. Pompey was dead, Crassus had fallen years earlier, and the optimates had either been defeated or deprived of power in Rome. There was no longer any serious military opposition to him. Rome now belonged to him alone. The return to Rome became a triumphal procession. Caesar celebrated several triumphs for his victories in Gaul, Egypt, Africa, and Spain. The streets were decorated, the population cheered. Prisoners like Vercingetorix were paraded in triumph before they were executed.
Caesar showed himself to be the undisputed ruler whose fame outshone all his predecessors. But in the midst of this splendor, there was also a shadow. Many senators no longer saw Caesar's uninterrupted victories as the savior of Rome, but as the man who had destroyed the Republic. His tireless energy, his undisputed greatness, his claim to autocracy, all this made him a tyrant for his opponents. With the campaigns in Africa and Spain, Caesar had eliminated the last enemies and put his power on an unshakable foundation. But precisely because he was now unchallenged at the top, the question began to become more urgent. What would he do with this power? Chapter 15. Caesar as Dictator. After the victories in Africa and Spain, Caesar returned to Rome as the undisputed ruler. No one could be dangerous to him anymore. His rivals were dead or defeated, his legions stood loyally by his side, and the people revered him for his victories and for the games he generously organized. But Caesar was not only a general and victor, he was now also the one who had to reorganize the Republic after years of civil war. The Romans had known the office of dictatorship throughout their history, an extraordinary power granted in times of crisis and usually limited to 6 months. Caesar, however, not only allowed himself to be appointed dictator, but extended his term of office further and further. First for a year, then for 10, finally for life. In doing so, he broke the traditional boundaries of the Republic and made himself de facto autocrat. But Caesar didn't just want power, he wanted to shape. He began a series of reforms that were far-reaching. The debt system was reorganized so that the burden for many citizens became lighter. Veterans were given land to build a new life after years of war. He gave offices not only to long-established senators, but also to men from the provinces, thus promoting the integration of the empire. His calendar reform became particularly famous. The ancient Roman calendar system was inaccurate and often led to confusion. With the help of Alexandrian astronomers, Caesar introduced the Julian calendar, which set the year at 365 days with leap years, a system that is still in force today. He also improved the administration of the empire. Provinces have been reorganized, corruption has been combated, and tax collection has been made more efficient. Caesar did not think only in the short term, but tried to create structures that could stabilize Rome in the long term. But despite all his reforms, his claim to power remained unmistakable. He had coins minted with his image, something that was unusual in the Republic and more in line with the kings of the East. He took honorary titles, had himself shown in a purple robe and with a laurel wreath, and took a seat on a golden throne. For many Romans who upheld their freedom and republican tradition, this was an affront. Caesar himself did not see himself as a tyrant, but as the savior of Rome. He believed that the Republic no longer functioned in its old form, too torn, too weak, too incapable of meeting the demands of a world empire. Only a strong hand, he thought, could create order. But he underestimated how deep the hatred of many aristocrats was for a man who flouted the old rules. The people, on the other hand, loved him. He organized games, gave grain donations, beautified the city, and promised peace after years of civil wars. For the simple Romans, he was the man who brought prosperity and stability. But it was precisely this popularity that made him more dangerous for the Senate. A ruler who was supported not only by weapons, but also by the people, threatened the power of the old elite as never before. Caesar's dictatorship was thus a paradox. On the one hand, marked by reforms that strengthened Rome, and on the other hand, by symbols of autocracy that his opponents turned against him. He was the most powerful man of his time, and at the same time, the man whose power caused mistrust and resistance to continue to grow. Chapter 16. Splendor and Shadow of His Reign. The years in which Caesar ruled as dictator were marked by a contradictory picture. On the one hand, Rome shone in the splendor of its victories, its reforms, and its fortresses. On the other hand, the shadows thickened, the mistrust, fear, and hatred that would eventually lead to his assassination. Caesar was omnipresent in Rome's public life. His triumphal processions surpassed anything the city had ever seen. In magnificent parades, he paraded his booty, prisoners, and symbols of his victories. Vercingetorix, the Gallic king, was shown in triumph before dying in prison. Prisoners from Africa, Spain, and the East marched through the streets in chains. Rome was celebrating, and Caesar was basking in the glory of a man who had conquered more than almost anyone before him. He had magnificent buildings built: the Forum Iulium with a new temple, public buildings that adorned the city and made his power visible. He planned to regulate the Tiber, drain swamps, and open up new provinces. His gaze was always directed to the future, to great things, to projects that made Rome the capital of a world power. But at the same time, criticism grew. Many senators found his omnipresence oppressive. Caesar was awarded honorary titles, which made him stand out more and more from the ranks of the citizens. He was a dictator for life, father of the fatherland, incomparable. His image appeared on coins, a break with the tradition that had always avoided depicting living people like kings in the Republic. But what fueled the most was the fear that he actually wanted to become king. Since the expulsion of the Etruscan kings, Rome had a deep aversion to any form of monarchy. Even the suspicion that someone was striving for the kingship was dangerous. When Caesar was publicly offered a royal crown by Mark Antony at a feast and rejected it, the scene was ambiguous. Did he really not want to be a king, or did he just not want it to look too obvious? Caesar remained a benefactor to the people. He lowered the price of grain, released debts, gave land to veterans, and organized games and festivals that made life more bearable. For many ordinary citizens, he was a hero who finally represented their interests. For the aristocratic, however, he was a tyrant who undermined the power of the Senate and destroyed the foundations of the Republic. Men who saw their freedom in the fact that no individual was allowed to rule over Rome felt dishonored and threatened. The mistrust turned into open hatred. On a personal level, Caesar also increasingly showed himself to be a man who believed he was above the rules. His affair with Cleopatra, whom he even brought to Rome, shocked many. The fact that he was seen in public with her and possibly considered her son as his heir hurt the pride of the Roman elite, who could never accept a foreign queen. Caesar's last years were a play of light and shadow. It created order where there was chaos, and it brought stability after years of civil wars. But he did it by uniting all power in his person. He brought splendor to Rome, but his splendor was dazzling, and in his shadow, the resolve of his opponents to overthrow him grew. Chapter 17. The Ides of March, the Assassination of Caesar. March 15, 44 BC, the so-called Ides of March, was to become the fateful day of Julius Caesar. In the weeks before, the tension in Rome had intensified. Many senators were convinced that Caesar was no longer dictator, but de facto king, a title that Rome had detested for centuries. His abundance of power, his honorary titles, his closeness to Cleopatra, and his appearance as an autocrat had fueled fears that the freedom of the Republic was lost forever. The conspiracy against him was formed in secret. Around 60 men, including influential senators, joined forces. Among them were Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus, the nephew of Cato the Younger. For Caesar, Brutus was more than a political opponent. He was a man whom he had promoted, whom he trusted, and whom he loved almost like a son. It was precisely his participation in the conspiracy that made the assassination so symbolic. The conspirators gave themselves the name liberators. They were convinced that they were not acting out of self-interest, but to save the Republic. But among the noble motives were also personal envy, wounded pride, and the fear of Caesar's superiority. On the morning of the Ides of March, Caesar had signs that could have warned him. Fortune tellers are said to have warned him of this day. His wife Calpurnia had reported gloomy dreams, and some friends asked him not to go to the Senate. But Caesar, who considered himself invincible, ignored all warnings. He didn't want to give the impression that he was afraid. When he entered Pompey's Curia, where the Senate was meeting that day, the conspirators were already waiting. At first, they pretended to present him with a petition. Then they drew their daggers. One after the other stabbed him. Caesar tried to defend himself, but he was soon overwhelmed. The tradition became famous that, when he saw Brutus among the attackers, he spoke the words, "Do you too, my son?" An expression of pain, betrayal, and resignation. Whether he actually said these words is uncertain, but they sum up the tragedy of the moment. Struck by countless stabs, Caesar collapsed at the foot of a statue of Pompey, the man who had once been his ally and then his greatest rival. His blood stained the ground, and with him fell not only a human being, but the symbol of a new order. The conspirators believed they had liberated Rome. They thought the citizens would cheer, the Senate would breathe a sigh of relief, the Republic would be revived. But they had underestimated the mood among the people. Caesar was loved, and his death shocked the people. Instead of jubilation, chaos spread. Fear, confusion, and anger gripped the city. The Ides of March were thus not the end of the dictatorship, but the beginning of a new phase of the Civil War. Caesar was dead, but his legacy lived on. In the people who loved him, in the soldiers who were loyal to him, and in the young adopted son he had appointed in his will, Gaius Octavius, later known as Augustus. This is how Caesar's life ended, not on the battlefield, but at the hands of men who called themselves his friends. His death was a drama that has gone down in history to this day as a symbol of betrayal, power, and fate. Chapter 18. After Caesar's death, chaos and revenge. When Caesar was stabbed in the Senate on March 15, 44 BC, the conspirators believed they had liberated Rome from a tyrant. But instead of jubilation, chaos reigned. The citizens were horrified, many fled to their homes, others wandered helplessly through the streets. The assassination of Caesar did not relieve the tensions, it exacerbated them. The senators who called themselves liberators had no clear plan for the time after the crime. They hoped that the Republic would simply return to its old state. But the reality was different. The people revered Caesar. Many saw him as the man who had brought peace and order. His death did not seem like a liberation, but like a crime. At first, the conspirators tried to control the situation. They appeared in the Senate, explained their motives, and hoped to win support. But it soon became clear that they did not have the means of power to enforce their position. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal confidant and consul, skillfully took the initiative. At first, he appeared to be conciliatory, spoke of peace and respect for the conspirators, but in reality, he planned to get the people on his side. The decisive moment came at Caesar's funeral. Antony gave a speech that is one of the most famous in Roman history. He described Caesar's merits, his victories, his benefits to the people. Then he showed Caesar's blood-soaked toga, pierced with dagger wounds, and called out the names of the murderers. The crowd was beside itself. Tears turned into anger, anger into frenzy. The people stormed through the streets, erected fires, haunted the houses of the conspirators. Many of them fled Rome head over heels. But in the midst of this chaos, a new figure emerged, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son. In his will, Caesar had appointed him as his heir. The young man, who was only 18 years old, was inexperienced but ambitious. No one suspected that he would one day become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. At first, Antony seemed to have the power, but Octavius quietly gathered followers, won over soldiers, and began to weave his own net. The Roman Empire fell into a new wave of civil wars. The conspirators Brutus and Cassius moved to the east to raise armies there.
Antony and Octavius, initially rivals, soon found a mode of cooperation. Together with Lepidus, they formed the Second Triumvirate, which acted with brutal severity against Caesar's murderers. Proscriptions were imposed. Enemies of the triumvirate were outlawed, their property confiscated, and many died. The great orator Cicero also fell victim to this wave of violence. The decision was made in 42 BC in the double battle of Philippi. There, the armies of Brutus and Cassius met the troops of the triumvirate. After a fierce battle, Caesar's legacy prevailed. Cassius committed suicide when he thought the battle was lost. Brutus held out longer, but after the final defeat, he also threw himself into his sword. With her death, the hope of the liberators to restore the Republic was extinguished. But even after that, there was no calm. Antony and Octavius, once allies, soon became bitter enemies. Their rivalry was to determine the next chapter of Roman history. But one thing was clear. The murder of Caesar had not saved the Republic, but had destroyed it once and for all. The chaos after his death showed how much he had already become the center of power. Without him, there was no balance, no order. Instead of freedom, his overthrow brought new civil wars. Instead of a republic, the path to the monarchy. His opponents wanted to overthrow him, but in the end, they created the basis for something even more enduring, the Roman Empire.
Chapter 19. Caesar's Legacy, Augustus, and the End of the Republic. The death of Caesar had created a power vacuum that the old republican structures could no longer fill. The assassination was supposed to save the Republic, but in reality, it had only hastened its end. The way was now clear for new power struggles, and at the center of it all was a young man who at first did not seem dangerous to anyone. Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew and testamentary heir. Octavius, who would later bear the name Augustus, was only 18 years old when he arrived in Rome after Caesar's death. Many underestimated him, considered him weak and inexperienced. But he showed astonishing political wisdom from the very beginning. He called himself Caesar's son and immediately won the sympathy of the veterans who had been loyal to the old general. The people also saw him as the legitimate successor. At first, Octavian worked together with Mark Antony, Caesar's closest follower. Together with Lepidus, they formed the Second Triumvirate, a kind of three-headed dictatorship that acted with brutal severity against its enemies. Proscriptions were imposed, lists of names of political opponents who were outlaws, whose assets could be confiscated, and who could be killed themselves. Hundreds of senators and knights lost their lives, including the famous orator Cicero, who had openly opposed Antony. Revenge on Caesar's murderers became the main goal. Brutus and Cassius, the leaders of the conspiracy, had gathered large armies in the east of the empire. In 42 BC, the decisive Battle of Philippi in Macedonia took place. In two massive battles, the troops of the triumvirate were victorious. Cassius committed suicide when he mistakenly believed that his troops had been defeated. Brutus held out longer, but after the final defeat, he also chose death. With that, the liberators were defeated, and the hope of a return of the old republic was gone. But the alliance between Antony and Octavian did not last long. Soon it broke down due to rivalry and mistrust. Antony turned to the east, where he found a powerful ally and lover in Cleopatra of Egypt. Together, they dreamed of dominating the east of the empire, perhaps even a new monarchy. In Rome, however, mistrust grew against Antony, who was accused of being seduced by a foreign queen. Octavian skillfully exploited this mood. He presented himself as a defender of Rome against the danger from the east. In 31 BC, the decisive Battle of Actium in Macedonia took place. In two massive battles, the troops of the triumvirate were victorious. Cassius committed suicide when he mistakenly believed that his troops had been defeated. Brutus held out longer, but after the final defeat, he also chose death. With that, the liberators were defeated, and the hope of a return of the old republic was gone. But the alliance between Antony and Octavian did not last long. Soon it broke down due to rivalry and mistrust. Antony turned to the east, where he found a powerful ally and lover in Cleopatra of Egypt. Together, they dreamed of dominating the east of the empire, perhaps even a new monarchy. In Rome, however, mistrust grew against Antony, who was accused of being seduced by a foreign queen. Octavian skillfully exploited this mood. He presented himself as a defender of Rome against the danger from the east. In 31 BC, the decision was made in the Battle of Actium. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated, fled to Egypt, and took their own lives a short time later. Octavian was thus the last undisputed ruler. In 27 BC, he received the honorary name Augustus from the Senate. Formally, he restored the Republic, but in reality, he founded the Principate, the monarchy under a different name. The Senate remained in place, offices continued to be awarded, but the real power lay with him alone. Augustus marked the beginning of the Roman Empire, which was to last for centuries. All of this was Caesar's direct inheritance. Without his victories, without his reforms, without his murder, Augustus's rise would not have happened. Caesar had shaken the structures of the Republic. Augustus completed its reconstruction. While Caesar had fallen as dictator, Augustus knew how to camouflage his autocracy and thus secure it permanently. Caesar's legacy thus lived on in two ways: in his name, which Augustus took as his title, and in the form of government that emerged from his fall. What the conspirators wanted to prevent came to pass. The Republic was dead, and the empire took its place.
Chapter 20. Caesar's legacy and his place in history. Julius Caesar had fallen at the hands of his enemies' daggers in March 44 BC. But his influence on history did not end with his death. On the contrary, in many respects, his real legacy only began afterwards. Neither his victories nor his reforms, neither his love affairs nor his political cleverness alone explain his importance. It was the sum of his life's work that made him one of the most influential figures in world history. Caesar had changed the Republic because he broke its borders. The Roman Republic was intended for a city, not for a world empire. Their institutions had grown over centuries, but they could no longer cope with the tensions between rich and poor, between Senate and people, between provinces and center. Caesar was the one who exposed the contradictions and bridged them through his own power. He showed that a single man was capable of directing the fate of an entire empire. His military achievements were enormous. With the conquest of Gaul, he had shifted the borders of Rome far to the north and created one of the richest provinces of the empire. His campaigns into Britain and across the Rhine were bold and visionary, even if they did not open up permanent territory. His victories in the Civil War showed his superior strategy, his ability to strike the decisive blow in seemingly hopeless situations. As a general, he is still one of the greatest in history. But Caesar was not only a man of the sword, but also of the word. His Commentarii de Bello Gallico are more than propaganda. They are masterpieces of clear language, sober presentation, and strategic analysis. To this day, they serve not only as a source for historians, but also as an example of the power of words for writers and politicians. His reforms changed Roman life permanently. The Julian calendar, which he introduced, formed the basis of our current calendar. His reorganization of the provinces, his laws, his attempts to solve the debt crises and to supply the army showed his eye for the whole. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to shape things, and in that, he was far more than a general. But his legacy is also ambivalent. For some, he was the liberator, the savior of Rome, the man who created order where chaos reigned. For others, he was the tyrant who destroyed the freedom of the Republic in order to put himself at the top. His name became synonymous with power. Caesar became a title in many languages. The Kaiser in German, the Tsar in Russia. His place in history is unique. Without him, Augustus would not have existed, and without Augustus, there would have been no Roman Empire that shaped the world for centuries. Caesar's life was the turning point at which the Roman Republic finally transitioned to monarchy.
He himself fell because he reached for autocracy too quickly, too openly. But it was precisely his failure that enabled Augustus to complete the work more intelligently and subtly. Caesar remains a figure full of contradictions, ambitious and magnanimous, merciless and merciful, soldier and writer, friend of the people and autocrat. He was a person who was not satisfied with boundaries, who always went further, who wanted to change the world, and did so. His death did not mark the end, but the beginning of a new era. From his blood grew the empire that made Rome the greatest power of antiquity. His name lives on, not only in the history books, but in language, in politics, in the idea of power itself. Thus, more than 2 millennia after his death, Julius Caesar remains one of the most radiant and at the same time most contradictory figures in history. A man who not only experienced the world, but reshaped it.